The archive smelled of cold ozone and older things. Data cores from campaigns finished before Vessek Ka'thrun was hatched, filed under Dominion classification tags that translated roughly to closed. He liked the smell. It meant nothing in the room could hurt him anymore. 11 species lived in that vault now, reduced to their final transmissions, their surrender protocols, their last attempts at dignity translated into Threxian administrative shorthand. Vessek had read all of them. He had annotated most of them. He had, on 3 separate occasions, been complimented by a superior for the asterisk elegance of his closure summaries, which was the kind of compliment that made a person want to lie down somewhere quiet and not get up. He was halfway through his ration when the 12th file arrived. It didn't come through proper channels. Proper channels meant a sealed data packet, a cover memo, a classification stamp, and at least 2 signatures above his own pay grade before it reached his terminal. This came raw, stripped, corrupted at the edges, routed through some emergency relay that had clearly not expected to be used for something this small. A first contact log. 17 seconds of audio. The rest static and burn scarring, where the transmission had degraded on its way through however many light years of empty dark. Vessek almost filed it as junk. Almost. He put it through the cleaner twice. The second pass gave him something like clarity, and clarity gave him a human voice. Young, male by the vocal registry, breathing hard, the kind of hard breathing that came from running or fighting or both. Behind him, other voices. Overlapping. Vessek couldn't parse the language yet. Nobody could. This was one of our one. First contact in the truest and stupidest sense. Some Dominion survey drone stumbling face-first into a species nobody had catalogued. But he didn't need the language to understand the asterisk tone. They were laughing. Not the survey team. Not the drone operators back on the relay station, who by all accounts had been screaming into their headsets trying to raise anyone at all, after their probe went dark. The humans. The people on the other end of a first contact encounter that had, according to the incident report stapled loosely to the file, ended with the total loss of a 3-person Dominion reconnaissance team and the drone that carried them. They were laughing like it was the funniest thing that had happened to them all week. Vessek sat with that for longer than he'd admit to anyone who might write it down. He had spent 11 closure files listening to the sound species made when they understood, finally and completely, that they had lost. He knew what fear sounded like in 9 different vocal ranges. He knew what surrender sounded like when it came fast, and what it sounded like when a species tried to hold onto some scrap of it and failed. He did not know what this was. He ran it through the emotional signature classifier anyway, mostly because it was expected of him, and the classifier returned a result he'd never seen before in 14 years of service. Insufficient data. Recommend manual review. The machine didn't know what to do with it either. That was, in its own quiet way, the most unsettling part. He filed his findings, 3 lines, clinical, the kind of understatement that had become his professional signature, and went to bed telling himself it was somebody else's problem now. Some survey division's headache, not his. He had 11 closure files and a backlog of cross-referencing to finish before the quarter turned over, and Command did not pay him to have opinions about 17-second audio fragments from a species that wasn't even confirmed to exist yet. He was wrong about it not being his problem within the week. Director Ushal did not summon people to her office. She appeared in doorways instead, which Vessek had always found more effective, because it removed the small mercy of a walk to steady yourself. She was in his doorway on the 4th morning after the 12th file, holding a data slate against her chest like something she didn't want touched, and she said his name the way she always did, like a question she already knew the answer to and disliked. Ka'thrun. Director. You flagged the anomalous contact log. Sector designation. She glanced down, though Vessek suspected she didn't need to. Sol 3. I flagged it for manual review. I didn't draw conclusions. There wasn't enough to draw conclusions from. There's more now. She set the slate on his desk, and it lit up under his hand with a level of clearance he hadn't held an hour ago. The species self-identifies as asterisk human. Homeworld's a single planet, single system, no colonies, no fleet to speak of that we've confirmed. Population estimates put them somewhere around 11 billion, which is either the most efficient use of a habitable rock we've ever recorded or a rounding error. And Survey seems to think it isn't a rounding error. That's an unusually small footprint for a species that just cost us a recon team. Yes, Ushall said, in a tone that suggested she'd already had this exact thought and hadn't enjoyed having it. It is. Vessek looked at the slate. Population figures, atmospheric data, a note from Survey flagged asterisk urgent in a shade of red the Dominion reserved for things that were either extremely dangerous or extremely embarrassing, sometimes both. Buried under the raw numbers was a single attached file, low resolution, salvaged off the drone's black box before the connection died completely. An image, ground level. A wide, cratered field under a colorless sky, and in the middle distance, structures that might have been fortifications or might have been something else entirely. Geometry Vesek's eye kept sliding off of like it didn't want to be understood. I want a full doctrinal workup, Ushall said. The standard model, same as the other 11. Find the fracture point, write the projection, hand it to the War Council before the Fleet Command finishes arguing about whether this is worth a proper invasion or a punitive strike. You want to close your file. I want to close your file, she agreed, on a species that killed a recon team and then, according to the audio, thought it was funny. Vessek didn't say what he was thinking, which was that 11 closure files had taught him precisely one useful thing about the process, and it wasn't a thing Ushall would want written down in a formal report. Species didn't laugh at the moment they understood they'd lost. They laughed at moments they understood they hadn't started losing yet. He kept that to himself, the way he kept most things to himself, and instead asked the question that actually mattered to his workload. Timeline. Yesterday, Ushall said, which was the only kind of timeline the Dominion ever gave anyone, and left before he could ask her anything else. He spent that night the way he'd spent the night before every one of his 11 prior assignments, reading everything available, which for Sol 3 amounted to embarrassingly little. A handful of intercepted transmissions, mostly incomprehensible, atmospheric scans. A rough topographical map assembled from 3 flybys, showing a planet that was, by any Dominion metric, a hostile place to have evolved on. Too much weather, too much tectonic movement, ice at both poles thick enough to reshape continents and apparently prone to doing exactly that on a schedule the survey team's geologist had annotated with something that read, even in translation, like disbelief. He found the doctrine file last because he always saved it for last, the way some people save the best part of a meal. It was the closest thing the Dominion had to scripture. 11 case studies, 11 species, 11 fracture points identified, exploited, closed. The Yurtle, whose rigid caste hierarchy meant you only had to break the top of it. The Ashkivar conquered, who could not tolerate an enemy inside a certain psychological distance of their breeding colonies, and would negotiate anything to keep one out. 9 others, each with its one true weakness underlined in Vesek's own careful hand across 11 separate files, because that was the doctrine, that was the whole doctrine, the thing the Dominion had built an empire out of. Every species carries one wound it never finished healing. Find it, press it, the war ends itself. It had worked 11 times. It had worked so consistently that Vessek had stopped thinking of it as a theory and started thinking of it as a law of nature, the way a physicist stops questioning gravity. Species evolved in an environment. The environment left scars. The scars never fully closed because a species that healed a scar all the way had usually died out proving it could, or never developed a reason to try. Somewhere in the long, comfortable arc of any civilization's rise was the one crisis it had never quite survived intact. He looked at Sol 3's topography again. The ice, the endless tectonic churn, the geologist's careful, disbelieving notes, and made himself write the standard opening line of the standard doctrinal workup, the same 11 words that began every closure file he had ever produced. Species designation, human. Analysis proceeds from identification of primary fracture point. He stared at the sentence for a long time before he let himself notice the thing sitting underneath it, small and cold, that he did not yet have the vocabulary to write down. He had 11 case studies, 11 species that had each nursed one long, unhealed wound across the safe, comfortable centuries of a rise nothing had ever seriously tried to stop. Sol 3's file didn't read like a rise. It read like something that had never once been allowed to stop bleeding long enough to call it a scar. He didn't sleep well. He told himself it was the workload. The doctrine had a name nobody used out loud, because saying it out loud made it sound like what it was. Internally, in memos and training manuals and the clipped shorthand of officers who'd stopped finding it remarkable, it was just the method. Vessek had learned it the way every Dominion analyst learned it, not from a manual, but from watching someone older do it once, badly, and then doing it himself a dozen times until badly became competently, and competently became the kind of thing you could do while thinking about something else entirely. He pulled the YRTL file first, because it was the cleanest example, and because he needed, before he touched Sol 3 again, to remind himself the method actually worked. The YRTL had built a civilization on hierarchy, so absolute it had its own grammar, verb conjugations that changed depending on whether you were speaking to a superior, an equal, or someone 3 castes beneath you. A language that made insubordination structurally difficult before it was even morally difficult. Vessek's own annotation, 8 years old now, sat in the margin of the file in a hand slightly less steady than his current one. They cannot conceive of authority without a chain. Sever the chain at its highest visible link and the rest will not know how to act without instruction. The Dominion had done exactly that. Not an invasion, an assassination, precise and almost gentle by Threxian standards, of exactly 11 individuals across the YRTL command structure. The war had ended 9 days later, not because the YRTL military had been defeated in any meaningful tactical sense, but because an army that had never once in its history received an order, it didn't recognize the shape of simply stopped, mid-motion, like a machine with its power cable pulled. Vessek remembered writing that closure summary. He remembered feeling, for about a week afterward, something uncomfortably close to pride. The HFY file was messier and he liked it less. Their fracture point wasn't structural, it was psychological, a hard-coded, evolutionarily ancient terror of enemies operating close to their breeding colonies, a terror so deep it overrode strategic sense entirely. The Dominion hadn't needed to win a single battle. They'd simply positioned 3 carrier groups within a specified radius of the colonies, and waited while the HFY High Command tore itself apart in an emergency session that lasted, according to intercepted communications, 11 hours, and ended in a surrender broadcast delivered by a voice that was, Vessek's own notes recorded, audibly relieved. 9 other files, 9 other wounds, a species whose entire economic structure depended on a resource so scarce that threatening its supply lines produced immediate capitulation, a species whose religious caste could not, under any theological framework available to them, order a war of aggression, meaning the Dominion only had to make every engagement look asterisk-like defense. On and on, each file its own careful little autopsy, each one ending the same way. The fracture found, the pressure applied, the war concluding itself with an efficiency that had made the Dominion, over the span of 6 decades, the largest continuous polity in this arm of the galaxy. 11 for 11. Vessek closed the last file and sat with the number for a while, turning it over like a coin he was checking for a second face. The first engagement report from Sol 3 came in 9 hours later, and Vessek read it standing up, which was not something he normally did. It wasn't a real battle. Fleet Command hadn't authorized anything approaching a real battle yet. This was a probing action. 3 light cruisers under Commander Yeltrick testing response times and defensive posture around what Survey had identified as a secondary human outpost, some kind of orbital installation well beyond Sol 3's homeworld. Standard procedure. Approach at a distance calculated to read as aggressive but not immediately hostile, gauge the reaction, withdraw, compile data. It had worked this exact way against 9 of the 11 prior species, who had responded with everything from panicked scrambling to immediate, fumbling attempts at diplomacy. The humans didn't scramble, and they didn't hail. They fired. Not wildly. Yeltrick's after-action report was insistent on this point, underlined it twice in a way that read, even through the flattening effect of military prose, like a man trying to convince himself of something. The human response had been immediate, coordinated across all 3 visible defense platforms, an economical asterisk, no wasted volleys, no panic fire, a targeting solution that adjusted cleanly when Yeltrick's lead cruiser altered course. 1 Dominion vessel took hull damage severe enough to force a withdrawal. The other 2 retreated without firing a shot back, because Yeltrick's standing orders were to gauge response, not engage, and the response had been gauged rather more thoroughly than anyone expected. What stopped Vessek wasn't the damage. Damage was data, data was fine. What stopped him was the transcript of Yeltrick's own bridge recording, appended at the bottom of the report, in which his tactical officer, a Threxian named Coral, whom Vessek did not know personally but whose voice on the recording had the particular flatness of someone reciting numbers to keep from thinking about what the numbers meant, reported that the human installation's defensive fire had continued, uninterrupted, calm, precise asterisk. For the full 11 minutes, it took the cruisers to disengage and reach safe jump distance. 11 minutes of sustained, disciplined combat against a numerically superior force, from a species with no fleet survey had confirmed, and a homeworld population that should not, by any resource model Vessek had access to, support this level of military production. And no distress call, no request for reinforcement, no panicked broadcast to the homeworld, nothing Dominion listening posts could intercept that suggested the installation had, at any point during the engagement, considered itself in serious danger. Vessek pulled the emotional signature classifier again, the same tool that had returned insufficient data on the 17-second laughing clip, and ran it against the transcript. It gave him the same result. He sat with that for a long time before writing, in the margin of his own workup, the first sentence of what would eventually become the thing everyone remembered him for and almost no one at the time wanted to hear. They do not appear to require the reassurance a defending force typically seeks. Recommend further study before doctrinal application. He knew, even as he wrote it, that recommend further study was the kind of phrase that got quietly deleted from a report before it reached anyone with the authority to act on it. He spent the following days doing the thing that had, across 11 prior assignments, always cracked a species open for him, reading their own history, not the Dominion's summary of it, but as much of the raw material as surveys, intercepts, and translation matrices could assemble. It was slow work. Human broadcast media was fragmentary, contradictory, and enormous in a way that suggested either a species with an unusually loose relationship to information control or one that had simply given up trying decades ago. He read what he could. News archives. Fragments of something called asterisk history curricula asterisk, apparently taught to their young in a structured, mandatory way, which struck him as significant before he even understood why. What he found, spread out across 10,000 years of a single continuous planetary record with no colonies to disperse the pressure, no frontier to bleed the violence outward into, was war. Not a war. Not even the kind of long, singular, formative war that had produced fracture points in 8 of the 11 prior species. War asterisk structurally as a permanent condition of the species' relationship with itself. Overlapping, generational, regional, total, interrupted only ever by exhaustion and never, so far as the record showed, by anything resembling a lasting peace. Every human institution he catalogued seemed to have grown directly out of some prior catastrophe. Every fracture he identified in one era had, by the next, been converted into doctrine, then into training, then into something so deeply embedded in the species' operating procedure that it no longer functioned as a wound at all. He found a passage, translated roughly, the source flagged as some kind of military academy text, that stopped him entirely. The purpose of a defensive position is not to prevent contact with the enemy. It is to control the terms on which contact occurs. He checked the estimated composition date against the rest of the historical record and found it was old. Not recent doctrine written in response to the Dominion. Old. Written by humans about humans, centuries before any human had ever seen a Threxian ship. 11 prior species. 11 fracture points, each one the scar tissue of a crisis that species had survived once, badly and never fully processed. He looked for Sol 3's equivalent scar and kept not finding it, because what he was looking at wasn't scar tissue at all. It was calluses, the kind that formed not from one injury but from doing the same painful thing over and over, for so long that the pain stopped registering as damage and started registering as simply how the hand worked. He didn't write that down yet. He wasn't ready to. Late that night, alone in the archive with the ration he hadn't finished, and the classifier's unhelpful asterisk insufficient data still glowing faintly in the corner of his display, Vessek pulled a file he hadn't opened in 6 years. His own service record, the section command required every analyst to maintain, and almost none of them ever reread. 3 campaigns, 1 commendation, 1 medical discharge from active combat duty that the record described, with the Dominion's usual gift for euphemism, as asterisk reassignment following extended operational stress. He didn't reread the details. He knew them well enough that rereading them served no purpose except to make the ration taste worse than it already did. What he was looking for was smaller than that. A single line buried in the closing psychological assessment, written by a staff physician he'd never spoken to before or since, that he had apparently found significant enough 8 years ago to flag, and had then, characteristically, never mentioned to anyone. Subject demonstrates unusually stable threat-response calibration, consistent with prolonged exposure. Recommend analytical rather than combat placement going forward. He read it twice. Then he closed the file, closed the terminal, and sat for a while in the dark of the archive listening to nothing at all, because the machines around him had all, sensibly, gone to sleep. The War Council did not ask Vessek for his opinion. It asked him for a fracture point, and when his workup arrived 3 weeks late with a section titled asterisk insufficient basis for standard doctrinal application, where the fracture point should have been, Fleet Admiral Threll read exactly 4 lines of it before summoning him in person, which in Vessek's experience meant someone intended to be unpleasant to him, without leaving a written record of it. Threll's office had a window that looked out on nothing, a maintenance bay, some cabling, the gray underside of a docking arm, which Vessek had always found appropriate for a man whose entire career had been built on looking at problems from exactly one angle. 11 species, Threll said, without preamble, tapping the offending report against his palm like he was deciding whether it deserved the effort of reading further. 11. You wrote 11 of these files yourself, Ka'thrun. Are you telling me the 12th one broke your method? I'm telling you, I haven't found the fracture yet. That's not what this says. Threll flipped to a marked page. Recommend further study before doctrinal application. Do you know what the War Council hears when I read that sentence out loud? They hear a historian who's decided he doesn't want the job anymore. I've read every scrap of their history survey could pull. I've read their military texts. I've read a school book written for their children that spends 40 pages explaining siege logistics in more technical detail than our own academy uses for third years. I am telling you, with everything that record shows, that this species does not have the kind of wound the method was built to find. Every species has one. Every species we've cataloged had the luxury of healing wrong, Vessek said, and heard the shape of the idea complete itself in his own mouth for the first time, which was a strange and slightly nauseating experience. The Yurtle built their hierarchy across 4 centuries of internal peace after their founding wars ended. The Ashkivar's breeding colony terror comes from one catastrophic loss, 400 years ago, that never happened again. Every fracture point we've ever exploited is the scar left by a wound that had time to close badly. Sol 3's record doesn't show one wound. It shows 10,000 years of the same wound reopening before it ever finished closing. There's no scar tissue to press on, Admiral, because there's no tissue underneath it that isn't scar. Threll set the report down very carefully. The way a man sets down something he's decided he's going to throw across the room in a moment, and wants a clean surface to do it from. You're telling the War Council to be afraid of a species with no fleet. I'm telling the War Council the method doesn't have a fracture point to identify. I'm not telling them to be afraid of anything. I'm telling them the tool they've asked me to use wasn't built for this. Then build a new tool, Threll said, or I find an analyst who can use the old one. The new tool, as it turned out, was Commander Yeltrick's fleet, expanded to 9 cruisers and given authorization for what Fleet Command's own orders described, with a straight face Vessek found almost admirable, as a *calibrated demonstration of overwhelming force intended to induce rapid capitulation. It was the method applied at scale in the absence of a fracture point, brute pressure where precision should have gone, the doctrinal equivalent of hitting a locked door harder because you'd lost the key. Vessek watched the engagement telemetry come in over 11 hours from a monitoring station 3 jumps back, which was as close as his clearance allowed and closer than he wanted to be. 9 cruisers dropped out of transit in formation around the orbital installation that had bloodied Yeltrick's first probe. This time, the humans didn't wait for a targeting solution to develop. The installation's defensive fire opened before the Dominion ships had finished their transit deceleration burn, which Vessek's tactical liaison, a young officer named Coral, the same one whose flat recorded voice had unsettled him weeks earlier, insisted afterward was not possible, that no sensor array should have had a firing solution on ships still shedding transit velocity, and yet the telemetry showed exactly that over and over. Until the word not possible stopped being useful, and someone changed the phrase in the after-action report to not previously observed. 2 cruisers were lost outright. A third limped away trailing atmosphere from a hull breach that should, by every model Coral's team had built, have been a killing blow, and wasn't because. This detail arrived 4 days later, buried in a salvage report nobody read carefully until it was too late to matter. The surviving crew had spent the 11 minutes of the engagement not panicking but sealing bulkheads in a sequence a rehearsed sequence. The kind of thing you only did smoothly under fire if you had drilled it so many times, it no longer required thought. The installation, meanwhile, sustained damage, took losses. Vessek's listening posts confirmed at least 2 human structures went dark during the engagement, atmosphere venting, no sign of recovery, and never once broadcast anything that resembled a request for reinforcement. What it broadcast, 20 minutes after the Dominion fleet withdrew, was a status report. Calm, numbered. The kind of thing you filed after a training exercise, not after losing a fifth of your defensive capacity to a 9-ship assault fleet. Vessek listened to the translated transcript 3 times before he understood what had actually bothered him about it. And when he found it, it was almost funny, in the specific, terrible way that things became funny to him lately. The report didn't describe the engagement as a crisis survived. It described it as asterisk data acquired. He wrote his second report that night, and this one he did not hedge. Being branded a defeatist, Vessek discovered, was less a single event than a slow change in the temperature of a room. Colleagues who had once sought his opinion on cross-referencing began routing around him. His requisitions for expanded historical access, more of Sol 3's fragmentary broadcasts, deeper translation passes, started returning denied with justifications that read like they'd been generated by someone who hadn't actually read the request. Ushal still summoned him to doorways, but the questions had changed shape. Where she'd once asked what he'd found, she now asked, with the particular gentleness of someone protecting a colleague from a mistake they were about to make permanent, whether he was certain about his conclusions, whether the stress of the assignment might be affecting his judgment, whether he wanted to consider handing the file to someone with less personal history clouding the work. He understood, distantly, that this was the Dominion doing to him exactly what it had always done to species. It couldn't immediately categorize, looking for the crack, the soft place, the point where pressure would produce the response it wanted. It did not escape him that he was, in this narrow and unpleasant sense, being subjected to the method himself, and that he had no idea whether he had a fracture point either, until the day he found out. Senai had been his research aide for 2 years, competent, quiet, the kind of junior officer who did excellent work and never seemed to want credit for it, which Vessek had always found restful. It was Senai who had helped him build the translation cross-index for Sol 3's historical archive, Senai who had flagged the military academy text that had unsettled Vessek so badly weeks earlier, Senai who Vessek had, without quite noticing he was doing it, begun to trust. It was Senai's name on the internal memo that reached Threll's desk 2 days after Vessek's second report, summarizing, accurately, thoroughly, with a level of detail that told Vessek exactly how long his aide had been compiling it, every instance in which Vessek Ka'thrun's professional judgment had, in Senai's assessment, been compromised by unresolved psychological trauma from his own combat service, up to and including his medical discharge, and the physician's note Vessek had never shown to anyone. Vessek found out about the memo from Ushal, standing in his doorway, holding it the way she'd held the 12th file weeks earlier, like something she didn't want to touch longer than necessary. He didn't do it out of malice, she said, which was, Vessek reflected, probably true and entirely beside the point. He did it because he believes it. He thinks you're wrong, Ka'thrun, and he thinks you're wrong for a reason that has nothing to do with Sol 3 and everything to do with you. Is he wrong? I don't know, Ushal said, with an honesty that cost her something he could tell. I don't think anyone does anymore. That's rather the problem. Vessek didn't ask what would happen to Senai. He suspected he already knew. A reassignment somewhere unpleasant, a quiet note in a file, the Dominion's own small, bureaucratic way of grinding down the people who'd been useful right up until they weren't. He found, turning it over, that he couldn't locate the anger he expected to feel, only a kind of tired recognition, because Senai had done exactly what the method predicted a frightened, cornered creature would do, found the nearest authority figure, and offered up the person closest to him in exchange for safety. It was almost elegant in its way. It was certainly familiar. It was also, Vessek realized, lying awake that night with the memo's language still turning in his head, the exact shape of the insight he'd been circling for weeks without letting himself land on it. Every fracture point the method had ever found, the Yurtle's chain of command, the Ashkevar's breeding terror, all 9 of the others, was the behavior of a creature that had never, not once in its recorded history, had to fight for its own survival on ground it could not retreat from. Every one of those species had colonies to disperse into, frontiers to bleed pressure outward toward, centuries of peace between their formative wounds in which the wound could heal into something soft and exploitable. Senai's memo was that same instinct, small and human-shaped in its own Threxian way, When the ground gets hot, find someone to hand over, buy yourself distance. Sol 3 had no distance to buy. One planet, no colonies, 10,000 years of a wound that never closed long enough to become exploitable, because the fighting never stopped long enough for softness to grow back over it. The Dominion had spent 6 decades perfecting a doctrine for breaking species that could afford to heal wrong. It had just declared war on the one species that never got the chance to heal at all. Fleet Admiral Threll did not summon Vessek to his office for the third engagement. He summoned the entire War Council, and he did it in a briefing room with no window at all, which Vessek understood immediately as an admission, dressed up as a precaution, that there was nothing outside worth looking at anymore. The operation had a name that translated, roughly, as *decisive correction*, which told Vessek everything he needed to know about the mood in the rooms above his own before he'd read a single line of the operational plan. 41 ships. Not a probe, not a calibrated demonstration. An invasion fleet, built around the doctrine Vessek had spent 2 reports arguing didn't apply, deployed anyway because the alternative was admitting, in front of a war council that had built an empire on 11 consecutive victories, that the 12th species might simply be unbreakable by the only method the Dominion had ever needed. Vessek was not asked to endorse the operation. He was informed of it, the way you inform a physician that a patient has declined treatment and gone home to die on their own terms, as a courtesy that changed nothing. He watched it from the same monitoring station, 3 jumps back, and this time Coral sat beside him instead of relaying findings after the fact, because Coral had asked to be reassigned to analysis rather than tactical command after the second engagement, a request that had gone through with unusual speed, which told Vessek something about how thoroughly the second engagement had reshaped at least one career besides his own. The fleet dropped into the Sol system in staggered waves, the way the doctrine prescribed, overwhelming presence first, secondary waves to reinforce whichever pressure point the initial contact revealed. Vessek watched the telemetry populate across the display and felt, for the first time since the 17-second laughing clip, something that wasn't quite dread and wasn't quite anticipation, sitting in the space between them. The humans let the first wave get close, closer than any of the 11 prior species had ever allowed a hostile fleet to approach, close enough that Coral murmured something about sensor ghosting before the telemetry corrected itself and showed them the truth. The human defensive line hadn't been where Survey's models placed it. It had been drawn back, quietly, patiently, over the weeks since the second engagement, into a configuration that put every one of the Dominion's 41 ships inside a kill zone that had been built, invisibly, out of exactly the kind of coordinated, rehearsed precision Vessek had already seen twice, and still hadn't fully priced into his own expectations. What happened next did not look like a battle so much as a demonstration, and it took Vessek several minutes of watching before he understood, with a cold clarity that arrived like ice water down the back of his collar, exactly whose doctrine he was watching executed against his own species. The humans didn't attack the fleet as a whole. They didn't need to. They identified within the first 6 minutes of engagement the 3 vessels carrying Dominion command staff, ships that should have been indistinguishable from the rest of the formation, their communication signatures buried under standard encryption, their positions rotated according to a randomization protocol the Dominion had used, unmodified, for 40 years. The humans found them anyway, targeted them specifically, and disabled all 3 within the same 90-second window, severing the fleet's command structure before the remaining 38 ships had finished executing their opening maneuver. Vessek thought distantly of a file 8 years old, of 11 precise assassinations, and a species whose entire military apparatus had stopped functioning the moment its chain of command was severed at the top. "They're running the Yurtle doctrine," Coral said, very quietly, as if saying it louder might make it more true than it already was. "They found the command ships. They cut the head off first. They didn't find the Yertle doctrine, Vessek said. They built it, independently, because sever the head first is not a Threxian invention, Coral. It is the oldest idea in the history of organized violence. We only ever thought it belonged to us because we were the only ones cataloging it. The remaining Dominion ships, leaderless, fell into exactly the kind of hesitation the doctrine predicted in any species whose command structure had never been designed to function without a visible chain of authority. Not panic, not yet, but a half-second of uncertainty, ship captains waiting for orders that weren't coming, checking in with each other across channels that hadn't been built for peer coordination, because peer coordination had never been necessary before. Half a second was not a long time. It was, however, exactly long enough for the second phase of the human defense to arrive, and Vessek watched it arrive with the specific, sick recognition of a man reading his own handwriting in someone else's report. The human counterstrike came in a pattern that mirrored, with an almost mathematical fidelity, the Ashkivar engagement. Concentrated, overwhelming pressure applied not evenly across the Dominion formation, but specifically toward the ships closest to what Sol 3's defenders had apparently identified, correctly, as the operation's logistical anchor. A supply and repair vessel trailing the main formation, unarmed, unremarkable, the kind of ship no Dominion tactician would have expected an enemy without extensive prior intelligence to single out. It went dark in under 2 minutes. Without it, the fleet's ability to sustain operations beyond the initial engagement window collapsed by a margin. Coral's models, running live, adjusted downward 3 times in 90 seconds because the numbers kept getting worse than the last calculation had allowed for. "They're not improvising," Coral said. "This is planned. This is Vessek, this is *us. This is every doctrine in the archive." "Not every doctrine," Vessek said, though even as he said it he understood he was watching the exception prove itself wrong in real time. "They can't have. There's no way they'd have access to the closure files. Those are sealed above War Council clearance." "Then they built it from the outside," Coral said. "They watched how we fight. 11 campaigns is a pattern, Vessek. A pattern is something you can reverse engineer if you're paying attention, and you have the patience to wait for it to repeat." Vessek said nothing, because the alternative to Coral's explanation was worse, and he was already turning it over in the part of his mind he hadn't let speak yet. That a species with 10,000 years of continuous, planet-bound war behind it did not need to steal the Dominion's doctrine to arrive at the same conclusions the Dominion had spent 6 decades assembling from 11 separate species. They only needed to have already discovered, on their own ground, against their own kind, every one of the ideas the Dominion had cobbled together piecemeal from other people's wars. Sever the command structure. Isolate the supply lines. Apply pressure at the psychological point where hesitation costs the most. These were not Dominion secrets. They were the oldest lessons war had to teach anyone patient enough to survive long enough to learn them. And Sol 3 had been enrolled in that particular school for longer than the Dominion itself had existed as a unified polity. The engagement lasted 11 minutes and 40 seconds. 22 Dominion ships were destroyed outright. 14 more sustained damage severe enough to force withdrawal under their own power, barely. 5 reached transit range intact, and of those 5, only 2 carried a command officer of any rank still capable of issuing coherent orders. Vessek watched the survivors limp toward the jump point on the display and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a clean professional name for. Not grief. Exactly, though there was grief in it somewhere, for Coral's colleagues aboard those command ships, for a fleet that had gone in believing, on some institutional level none of them had fully examined, that 11 victories made a 12th inevitable. It was closer to the feeling he imagined a physicist might have upon watching gravity fail to apply in some new and inconvenient corner of the universe. Not fear of the fact itself, but a vertiginous recalculation of everything the fact touched. "Sir," Coral said, and it took Vessek a moment to realize the young officer was addressing him with a rank he did not hold, an instinctive courtesy extended to the only person in the room who had apparently seen this coming. "What do we tell the council?" Vessek looked at the tactical display, at the wreckage cooling in Sol 3's outer system, at the two surviving command ships transmitting damage reports in the clipped, exhausted cadence of officers who had just watched every assumption their careers were built on fail in real time. "We tell them the truth," he said. "We tell them the method was never a law of nature. It was a pattern we found in species that had the luxury of healing wrong, and we mistook the pattern for physics because it worked 11 times in a row. And we tell them this species doesn't have a wound to press because they never stopped bleeding long enough for one to form. They didn't heal wrong. They didn't heal at all. They just got very, very good at fighting while it was still open." Coral was quiet for a long moment. "That's not a report the council will want to receive." "No," Vessek agreed. "It isn't. I imagine that's rather the point of writing it down anyway." He stayed in the monitoring station long after Coral left, watching the last of the wreckage telemetry resolve into the Dominion's clean, clinical loss tables, ships, personnel, projected cost of replacement, numbers that would move through the bureaucracy above him and come out the other side as a footnote in someone's quarterly report, the way 11 other campaigns worth of numbers had come out the other side as footnotes before this one. He thought of the 17-second clip that had started all of this, the sound of humans laughing at a moment the Dominion's classifier had insufficient data to explain. He understood it now, or believed he did, which was its own kind of terrible clarity. They hadn't been laughing because they didn't understand what had just happened to their recon team. They'd been laughing because they understood it completely, had understood it for 10,000 years before the Dominion ever built its first jump drive. And the joke, the whole, entire, cosmic joke of it, was that an empire that had never once had to fight for its own survival on ground it couldn't retreat from had just shown up to teach war to the one species that had never been allowed to stop learning it. He began writing his third report before the lost tables had even finished compiling, and this time he did not hedge a single sentence. Threll read the third report in full this time. Vessek had confirmation of that much, at least, because Threll's own aide told him so, in the flat, apologetic tone of a man delivering news he'd been ordered to deliver without editorial comment. What Threll did with it after reading it, Vessek learned only secondhand, in the particular way bad news traveled through the Dominion's administrative arteries, not as an announcement but as an absence. His clearance narrowed. His terminal access to the closure archive, the same archive that had smelled of cold ozone and older things on the first page of this whole account, was revoked without explanation on a fourth-day morning, replaced by a message that thanked him for his service and informed him his continued presence was not required pending review. Pending review was, in Dominion usage, a phrase with no fixed endpoint. Vessek understood this. He had written the phrase himself in 11 separate closure files, describing the fate of officers on the losing side of species he'd helped catalog into submission. It had a bitter, circular elegance to it now, being on the receiving end of a euphemism he'd spent a career deploying against other people's defeated colleagues. He was not arrested. That distinction mattered to him in the weeks that followed more than he expected it to. He was simply set aside, the way you set aside a tool that had proven unsuited to the job you'd bought it for, still theoretically useful, no longer trusted with anything that mattered. He kept a small apartment 3 transit stops from the archive he could no longer enter. He kept, more importantly, a personal data core he had never officially logged with command, onto which he had copied, in the last hour before his access closed, every version of the third report, every scrap of raw telemetry from the second and third engagements, every piece of Sol 3's fragmentary historical record he'd spent months assembling. He told himself, copying it, that he was preserving the work for whoever eventually needed it. He understood, somewhere under that he was also preserving evidence, in case pending review ever resolved itself in a direction he needed to defend himself against. Decisive Correction was not the last Operation Fleet Command launched against Sol 3. It was, however, the last one launched under the doctrine Vessek had spent his career refining, because the two operations that followed it, smaller, more cautious, dressed up in language that no longer promised rapid capitulation. Both ended the same way, with Dominion forces withdrawing after inflicting damage that looked significant on a lost table and meant nothing to a species that had, Vessek's final analysis argued, never expected war to be anything other than costly. You could not break an enemy by teaching them a lesson they had already spent 10,000 years learning from each other. The formal cessation of hostilities came 11 months after the first corrupted transmission reached Vessek's desk. Not a surrender on either side, not quite, but something closer to what the historical record on Sol 3 itself might have called an armistice. A mutual, exhausted acknowledgement that further engagement cost more than either side could currently justify. The Dominion's official communications described it, inevitably, as a strategic recalibration. Vessek, reading the announcement from his narrowed clearance in the small apartment 3 stops from the archive, thought of the word closure and understood, for the first time in his career, what it actually felt like from the losing side of the file. He was not present for any of the negotiations. He was not consulted on the terms. He learned, months later secondhand, that the human delegation had opened proceedings with a written statement, translated brief delivered without theater, that acknowledged Dominion losses with what the transcript's Threxian annotator had flagged, almost bewildered, as unexpected formality, possibly ceremonial, function unclear. Vessek read that annotation and thought about 10,000 years of continuous war, about a species that had learned, the hard way over and over, that the only thing worth being ceremonial about at the end of a fight was the fight itself, because everything else was noise. It was, he thought, the closest thing to respect the Dominion was ever going to receive from Sol 3, and it had been mistaken, in translation, for procedure. The leak happened 18 months after his clearance closed, and Vessek did not orchestrate it, though he was never entirely believed on that point by the small number of people who eventually tried to establish blame. What actually happened was smaller and stupider than anyone's conspiracy theories. A mid-level archivist, reorganizing sealed files ahead of a routine audit, misfiled a data core, Vessek's personal, unlogged copy of the third report, which had somehow ended up in an evidence locker attached to his suspended clearance review, into a batch scheduled for declassification under a routine 15-year sunset rule that nobody had thought to exempt it from, because nobody remembered it existed to exempt. By the time anyone noticed, it had already propagated through 2 research networks and 1 very indiscreet academic symposium on comparative doctrine, and pulling it back was, as one increasingly frantic memo from Fleet Command's Information Security Office put it, no longer a containable action. Vessek learned about it the way most of the galaxy did, slowly then all at once, in the specific way information traveled once enough independent parties had a reason to keep it moving. A colleague he hadn't spoken to in a year sent him a single line, unsigned, that simply read, "They're teaching your Sol 3 report at the War College now. Half the instructors hate it. All of them assign it." He did not go back to command. He was not invited to. What he did in the months that followed was watch, at a distance, through the same fragmented public channels he'd once used to piece together Sol 3's own history, as the report he'd written to be buried became something closer to the opposite. Other species the Dominion had not yet encountered, species with their own histories of unfinished violence, began requesting translated copies through back channels that had nothing to do with Dominion clearance structures at all. A phrase from his third report, "they didn't heal wrong, they didn't heal at all," began appearing, stripped of context, in places Vessek had never expected an internal Dominion analysis document to travel. Independent news broadcasts, a philosophical journal published out of a system 3 jumps beyond the Dominion's furthest border, and in the single detail that undid something in him he'd kept carefully controlled for over a year, a human transmission. He found it by accident, the way he'd found most things that mattered in this whole account. An intercepted fragment, low priority, routed through a listening post that had kept monitoring Sol 3 traffic out of habit long after the armistice made it strategically pointless. A human broadcast, public, some kind of educational program, discussing. Vessek sat very still when the translation resolved. The Threxian Dominion's own captured wartime analysis of their species, presented not as intelligence but as something closer to a cautionary artifact. A document one human commentator described, in a phrase the translation matrix rendered with unexpected precision, as asterisk the enemy finally getting it right, a little too late to matter to him personally. They knew who he was. They had his name. They had somehow more of his personal history than he'd expected any human intelligence apparatus to have bothered assembling, given how little Sol 3's own recon capability had extended into Dominion space during the brief war. He never learned exactly how they'd gotten it, whether from the same leak that had freed his report from its evidence locker, or from some quieter channel he'd never be cleared to know about now. What he understood, sitting with the broadcast fragment in the small apartment 3 stops from an archive he was still not permitted to enter, was that the species he had spent a year trying to explain to people who did not want to hear it had, in its own patient, watchful way, been studying him back. Of course they had. They had 10,000 years of practice understanding exactly which of an enemy's people were worth watching closely, and which were noise. He never returned to active service. The review that had been asterisk pending for 2 years quietly resolved itself, eventually, into a permanent reassignment to a records division so far from anything resembling operational relevance that Vessek understood it for what it was. Not punishment, exactly, but a kind of institutional forgetting. The Dominion's way of ensuring the man who'd written the report could not be blamed for it directly, while also ensuring he would never again be positioned to write anything like it. He found, to his own mild surprise, that he did not mind this as much as he might have expected to, 3 years earlier, standing in the doorway of an office that smelled like cold ozone and older things. He had spent a career cataloging the deaths of species that had never fully understood what killed them until the moment it was too late to matter. He had, in the end, been given the rarer and stranger privilege of watching a species survive the thing that should have killed it, and of understanding, before almost anyone else in his own civilization was willing to, exactly why. He kept a copy of the 3rd report in his own small archive, unsealed now, unnecessary to hide. He added a final page to it, eventually, years after the events it described, not because anyone had asked him to, but because 11 closure files and one that refused to close had taught him that a record without an ending was just an open wound with better paperwork. This is the 12th file, and it does not close the way the other 11 closed. There is no fracture point recorded here because none was found. There is only this, a species we tried to break using tools built for creatures who had the luxury of healing wrong, applied against one that never stopped bleeding long enough to heal at all. We called them the enemy. History, theirs and ours both, will likely remember us as one more wound they survived. If any reader finds this file after me, Dominion or otherwise, take the one lesson 11 other campaigns never taught us in time. Study the wound before you press it, or you may find you've been teaching the enemy your own war all along.